Let's watch this speech of Rand Paul criticizing Obama because it predicts a lot happening in America today.
The President of the United States often faces unforeseeable dilemmas that demand tough decisions based on reliable intelligence. The recent events in Libya presented President Obama with such a scenario. But how our Commander-in-Chief chose to handle this new dilemma raises serious questions about his understanding of constitutional checks and balances. Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi is every bit the madman Ronald Reagan once said he was. But are the rebels adherents to Jeffersonian democracy or bin Laden's radical jihad? In 2007, then-candidate Obama said that the president does not have power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation. I agree with the candidate Obama. Unfortunately, President Obama has failed to heed his own advice. He has ignored our Constitution and engaged us in a military conflict without congressional debate and approval. What imminent threat did Gaddafi or Libya pose to the United States? Obviously, the decision to take military action of this magnitude is something that should not be taken lightly and should first require determining whether it is in the United States' vital national interests. Over the weekend, even Defense Secretary Robert Gates admitted that America has no vital interest in Libya. Our brave men and women in uniform are patriotic defenders of our nation. They are members of the greatest military in the world, and in times of war, I am confident of their willingness and ability to ensure that our vital interests are protected. But they should not be asked to be nation builders or the world's policemen, and they should serve in wars authorized and called for by the United States Congress, not the United Nations. At the moment, there are uprisings taking place across the Middle East. The problem with sending U.S. military to help rebels in Libya or anywhere else is that we are taking sides in a conflict and on behalf of a people whom we know nothing about. When or if there is regime change in Libya, what kind of leadership exactly will replace Gaddafi? Who are the Libyan rebels exactly? The Daily Telegraph reported over the weekend that some Libyan rebel leaders now claim they have members of al-Qaeda within their ranks and are glad to have them. Why do we have American soldiers, our best and bravest, helping people in Libya who may be the very same people we ask our military to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq? Intervening in a civil war in a tribal society in which our government admits that we have no vital interest to help people we do not know simply does not make any sense. Libyan society is complicated, and we simply do not know enough about the potential outcomes or leaders to know if this will end up in the interests of the United States or if we are in fact helping to install a radical Islamic government in place of a secular dictatorship. Of even more lasting concern is how our troops were committed to this battle by President Obama. The Founding Fathers understood the seriousness of war and thus included in our Constitution a provision stating that only Congress can declare war. The decision to wage war should not be taken cavalierly. As Madison wrote, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature." If President Obama had consulted Congress, as our Constitution requires him to do, perhaps we could have debated these questions before hastily involving ourselves in yet another Middle Eastern conflict. While the President is the commander of our armed forces, he is not a king. He may involve those forces in military conflict only when authorized by Congress or in response to an imminent threat. Neither was the case here. We are already in two wars that we are not paying for. We are waging war across the Middle East on a credit card, one whose limit is rapidly approaching. We already borrow money from countries like China to pay for our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Should we continue borrowing money and saddling future generations with debt to pay for our current actions in Libya? The subtext to the President's speech concerning Libya tonight was, what if we had done nothing? But a better question might be, what if helping Libya's interests actually hurts America's interests? What if we are sending our military to places where we might actually be helping the same terrorists we fight in other countries? It's time that we re-examine these policies by once again consulting the Constitution on such matters and the common sense principles that made this country great. We can no longer afford to spend what we don't have, and and we can't afford to address every other nation's problems before we address our own. Over the coming days and weeks, Congress will force President Obama to confront these questions. Our brave young men and women have answered the call of duty time and time again over the past decade. Our soldiers deserve, at the very least, that before we send them into a third war, that Congress, the People's House, deliberate, debate, and decide whether this war is in our vital national interests. Thank you for listening tonight, and God bless the United States of America.
If you go back and listen to that speech today, it's honestly incredible how much of what Rand Paul warned about ended up becoming reality. At the time, the media establishment, the foreign policy class, and most Democrats were completely behind Barack Obama's intervention in Libya. They framed it as humanitarian, necessary, and morally righteous. Anybody who questioned it was treated like they didn't care about human rights or civilian lives. But Rand Paul stepped into that debate and asked the one question Washington never wants to answer honestly. How exactly does this help the United States of America? That was the core of his argument. Not emotional slogans, not vague promises about democracy, not another nation-building fantasy. He wanted to know what actual American interest justified military intervention. And even Obama's own Defense Secretary Robert Gates admitted there was no vital U.S. interest in Libya. Think about that. The administration was launching military operations while admitting America itself was not directly threatened. Rand Paul also hit Obama on something that exposed a massive hypocrisy problem. Back when Obama was running for president in 2007, he openly said that presidents do not have constitutional authority to launch military attacks without congressional approval unless there's an imminent threat to the country. Rand Paul agreed with candidate Obama. But once Obama got into power, suddenly those constitutional principles disappeared, and that's the part that frustrated a lot of Americans. The Constitution isn't supposed to change depending on which party controls the White House. If Republicans abuse executive power, Democrats scream about dictatorship. If Democrats abuse executive power, suddenly the media calls it leadership. Rand Paul was calling out that double standard directly. What's even more important is that he warned about something that became a recurring disaster in American foreign policy: backing rebel groups we barely understand. He asked who exactly these Libyan rebels were. Were they freedom fighters, were they pro-democracy reformers, or were radical Islamist factions mixed into the movement? At the time, the political class brushed those concerns aside like paranoia. But history proved those concerns were legitimate. After Gaddafi fell, Libya didn't become some shining democracy. The country descended into chaos, factional violence, instability, militia warfare, and extremist influence. The power vacuum turned Libya into a disaster zone. Weapons spread across the region. Terrorist groups benefited from the instability. Even years later, Libya remained deeply fractured. That's exactly the kind of unintended consequence Rand Paul was warning about. And this is what frustrates many conservatives about Washington interventionism in general. There's always a sales pitch. We're told military action will be quick, clean, humanitarian, and morally necessary. Then years later, Americans are left paying the price financially, militarily, and strategically while the people who push the intervention quietly move on to the next one without accountability. Rand Paul also made another point that matters even more today because America's debt situation is far worse now than it was then. He talked about how we were already borrowing money from countries like China to fund wars overseas. Think about how insane that sounds. America was literally going deeper into debt while trying to police conflicts across the Middle East. That warning aged extremely well. Today the national debt is even more explosive. Inflation has hammered working Americans for years, and people are increasingly asking why Washington always seems to have unlimited money for foreign interventions but endless excuses when Americans need help at home. That frustration didn't come out of nowhere. Speeches like this helped fuel it. Rand Paul's argument wasn't isolationism the way critics tried to frame it. He wasn't saying America should never defend itself. He was saying military force should actually be tied to clear national interests, constitutional authorization, and a serious understanding of consequences. That used to be considered common sense. Now in Washington, even asking those questions can get you labeled extreme. What also stands out is how aggressively he defended Congress's role in declaring war. He reminded people that the Founding Fathers intentionally gave that power to the legislature because they feared presidents becoming too eager to use military force. That concern goes all the way back to James Madison. The founders understood that executives naturally accumulate power during war, which is why checks and balances matter. But over the years, presidents from both parties have steadily expanded military authority without formal declarations of war. Libya was another example of that trend. Obama bypassed Congress, leaned on international coalitions and the United Nations, and treated military intervention like something the executive branch could simply decide on its own. A lot of Americans watched that happen and started realizing that Washington had developed a bipartisan interventionist mindset. Different rhetoric, different talking points, same result: endless involvement overseas with unclear objectives and long-term instability. And here's the uncomfortable truth many establishment politicians still avoid admitting: sometimes doing something can absolutely make things worse. Rand Paul said maybe helping Libya's interests could hurt America's interests. At the time, that sounded controversial. Looking back now, it sounds like basic realism. That's why this speech still resonates years later. It wasn't just about Libya. It was about executive overreach, endless wars, reckless spending, blind interventionism, and a political class that too often acts first and thinks later. Rand Paul was warning that America cannot keep trying to solve every global conflict while ignoring constitutional limits and burying itself in debt at home. And whether people agree with every single point he made or not, one thing is undeniable: he was asking serious questions that Washington elites did not want to answer. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you comment below with your thoughts on Libya and America's foreign policy failures over the years. Do you think Rand Paul was right? And do you think Washington ever really learned its lesson? Also hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video.